The Chinese economy has been facing a slowdown due to a weakening of global demand and trade war with the United States, and a series of domestic structural problems. These issues have caused a decrease in Chinese exports, a rise in unemployment, and a decrease in consumer spending. The Chinese government has responded by cutting interest rates, increasing infrastructure spending, and launching a series of stimulus measures. However, the effects of these measures have yet to be seen, and the future of the Chinese economy remains uncertain. The China economic crisis is an economic downturn that began in the late 1990s, causing a rapid decline in China's GDP growth rate, high unemployment, and an increase in public debt. The crisis was caused by a combination of factors, including an overexpansion of the Chinese economy, an over-reliance on exports, and a lack of domestic consumer spending. The crisis has had a lasting impact on the country's economy and has forced the government to make sweeping changes to its economic policies. What is China's economy in 2023? China is world's second largest economy. The GDP growth rate is only 5.2%. Exports are 20% and imports are 17% of the GDP. Inflation is 2.8%. Unemployment is 5.2%. The current account is 2.3% of the GDP. External debts are 14% of the GDP. Internal debts are 77% of the GDP. Income is 25% of GDP and expenses are 33% of GDP. Hello everyone, let's discuss the big problems of China's economy. The property sector of China is getting worse. Millions of houses could be taken down in the coming days due to a crisis within. It would be very difficult for the Chinese banks to keep up during this year. The reason is they have more than $550 billion houses. It is reported by Chinese media that 4 banks in Hunan province and 2 banks in Hubei province are gone closed. In fact, there are many crises that China is going through, and these are the genuine crises. The banking crisis and now the debt crisis. 5 banks have already collapsed, and these were the SME banks. SME means the small and medium enterprise. These days China's GDP is fighting for cash. The Chinese economy hit a growth rate of just 3% in 2022. It was just because the government of China made one critical error that has a ton of lessons for other countries in the world. China's 2 major sectors are going slow down: the real estate and banking sector. Let's start from the 2008 crisis and how that hit China's economy. China, from a very poor country, became the second largest economy. Secondly, foreign direct investment has gone from zero to more than 110 billion. Millions of people were uplifted from poverty and started labor work. When the 2008 crisis smashed the Western countries, it badly upset the Chinese economy because China was the world's factory, but when the companies faced the cash crisis, the demand was distorted of these companies literally did not have much to manufacture. In consequence, foreign direct investment started slowing down. If we examine the investment growth in China, it declined from 29% to -13% in 2009. This is when the Chinese authorities realized that they cannot be so dependent on other countries for China's growth. So, they wanted to do something fast and effective to keep their economic growth upward. Therefore, they came up with a strategy to artificially inflate the Chinese economy. Now the question is how they artificially inflate the Chinese economy. They adopted the 3 major strategies to inflate the economy. They gave the Chinese local government targets to meet GDP requirement. Let's suppose 100 crores, but with the condition that they cannot borrow a loan. Their income was only 50 crores, but they were not allowed to borrow money from banks to meet their income so that the expenditures could be met. In other countries, if a local government does not have sufficient funds, they borrow money from banks. And this is called internal borrowing from banks. The second problem was that even though the banks were asked to give out loans, even though there was a lot of demand for these loans, the banks had to limit their fixed deposit interest to around 2% and the lending rate to around 5%. At the same time, they had a lot of restrictions that prevented them from giving out loans beyond a certain level. So, if you're a businessman, even though your credit history is great but you cannot borrow beyond a certain limit, your loan processing would take a lot of time. In a common scenario, banks wants to make money by lending loan at a higher interest rate. But in this situation, they cannot due to government restrictions. The local government has had a target to achieve, but it is not able to borrow enough money to achieve those targets. Lastly, the people of China want loans for their businesses, but they aren't getting them because of government restrictions, and this was a result of shadow banking. Shadow banking means financial intermediaries that lend money just like banks but aren't regulated like banks. The big concern of China is the big and fast-growing shadow banking system. Shadow banking is a system consisting of leaders and brokers who fall outside the empire of the traditional regulated banking. So shadow banking is generally unregulated and it is not subject to the same kinds of liquidity and capital restrictions as traditional banks. Basically, they are unregulated as compared to traditional banks because the Chinese banks were so slow and so picky about their loans. All this demand went into the shadow banking industry such that people were willing to take a loan even at 18% interest. And it's not just the private entities but even the banks started private lending. For example, let's say a bank has 10 crores of cash to be lent and a businessman needs 10 crores for his working capital in the organized market. The banks will have to do all the due diligence and give you the loan at around 6% interest, and it will do it in a very restrictive and slow manner. With private lending, the bank would immediately give you a loan of 10 crores and keep it off their balance sheet. Eventually they'll charge you an interest of 18% on it. This way people get loans and the banks get profits. This is the simple functioning of shadow banking in China. So tomorrow if anyone defaults, the bank does not have to show it on the balance sheet. Hence it could escape the government, and just like this not just businessmen but even local governments started borrowing from banks privately at a higher interest of 18%. Because they were forced to meet their targets. So the problem over here is even now the banking system is functioning exactly the same way. The banks are still giving out loans, the businesses that are still taking these loans, and even the local government was taking out these loans in order to increase the GDP. It grew very quickly after 2008 to touch very high levels in 2016, more than 25 trillion yuan. This is when the government of China felt that they had messed up and the shadow banking industry had gone beyond control. So, they came up with deleveraging strategy in 2016. The president of China tightened control on banks. Bankers were being told to rectify their mindsets. President has made it quite clear that he's worried about the leverage in the system. And he wants to deleverage the economy. So, in this campaign, the government said strict lending restrictions for trusts and NBFCs and started imposing tight regulations. Just like the banks, and they cracked down on anyone who did not follow these regulations. These measures were very significant, therefore they started decreasing in 2016 and dropped significantly and almost disappeared by the end of 2018. Now this is where most people think the problem was solved, but there was another big problem. And that was a real estate crisis. China setbacks 15 high-rises because constructors ran out of money to finish them. The most indebted property company in the world is Grand Gru Evergrande. It was the largest property developer in China. Now it has the largest debt pile in the world. The crisis in China's the property sector is getting worse at running out of patience. Chinese home buyers are halting payments on unfinished projects. If this sector collapses, it could take the entire Chinese economy with it. Let's try to understand this using an example. Let's say you are a real estate company that needs a total investment of 100 crores and that in two phases. Phase 1 and Phase 2, whereby you need 50 crores for each piece. So for the first phase of construction you take in 25 crores from shadow sources at 18%. And 25 crores from the banks at 6% interest. But after the deal averaging campaign, the shadow bank is no longer giving loans to you. And at the same time, because the Chinese banks are so slow, that now for the second phase, you need 50 crores to complete your projects, and at max, assuming that the bank gives you a loan, you will get 25 crores, and that too after a lot of delay. Now for the final 25 crore, you don't have any money for either of the shadow sources or the organized market. Due to the banking restrictions, this is exactly what happened in China, whereby because of the cash crunch the building projects kept on getting postponed. So, the builders did two things. Number one, they slowed down the construction projects. Because of this, all the supplies like cement, steel and other commodities witnessed a business slowdown. And secondly, they started taking cash up front with something called pre-construction sales. Let's take an example. They had 10 flats worth 100 yuan. They would sell these flats at 80 yuan each, giving a 20 discount to the buyer. So they would collect 100 in cash from 10 home buyers collectively, so this way flat owners get a 20 discount. And at the same time, the builders get 80 yuan in capital at 0% interest to complete their projects. This is what the builders did to save their projects. But the third thing happened, whereby the home buyers were now preferring a flat, but under construction and not ready-made flats, because under constructed flats cost low. Therefore, the pre-construction sale would obviously go with a discount option. This is what happened in China, because of which new flat sales in China started to spill and rose by 20% in 2018. But at the same time, the sales of the completed houses dropped by 26% in terms of floor space. Sales of the pre-construction houses were still rising because of people's demand. And therefore, the builders started taking money and started investing in pre-construction. which causes uncompleted properties, and in 2021 it touched a dangerous level whereby the completed properties held for sale were barely 15% of the properties under development. So, the problem here is cash was stuck with the already constructed flats that were not getting sold at all. So naturally the developer started postponing the delivery of the houses, and this caused the first wave of crisis in China, whereby hundreds of residential buildings were left half constructed. As people saw that they were not getting possession of the houses, they stopped paying their repayments and started defaulting on their loans. And this caused the second wave of crisis in China, whereby the defaulting of house buyers led to a drastic fall in the real estate prices. According to the sales, home prices in 100 cities fell for a sixth month in a row in December 2022, and that too by 6 to 7% in a single year. So, this is where the third wave of crisis started in China, which was the banking crisis a few months ago. 4 rural lenders in the northern province of Henan froze the deposits of hundreds of thousands of customers. China's banking sector remains vulnerable. According to some assessments, they're doing worse than their Western counterparts, going by one estimate. At least more than 4 lakh customers were affected. The deposits were frozen because of mass defaulting of both businesses and home buyers. 5 banks in China collapsed last year due to bank runs, and not just that, around 4,000 small lenders, who owns a quarter of China's banking industry, is in a similar situation, which is very tight, and as of now the banking sector of the country looks very unattractive. And the real estate sector, which contributes almost 30% of the country's GDP, is slowing down. This further created the fourth wave of the crisis, which is something called the wealth effect. The wealth effect means that people tend to spend more as the value of their asset increases, and they spend less when the value of their asset decreases. When 1 million buyers cut down on their expenses, it automatically led to an economic slowdown in the country. This is one reason why China grew by just around 3% in 2022. On the other hand, other businesses classified into SMEs, which contributed more than 60% in China's GDP, are not able to get enough cash from the banks because of the restrictions on bank. In the end, I would conclude it as the economic crisis in China has been driven by a combination of factors. However, the Chinese government has taken proactive measures to address the crisis, including stimulus packages, structural reforms, and trade negotiations. These efforts aim to stabilize the economy, promote sustainable growth, and mitigate the effects of the crisis on various sectors. This is all for today, and I shall bring up some other important topics about China in future. If you learned something valuable, please make sure to the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for watching.